Hey guys, it's Abby here from the Homeschool with Moxie podcast, and this is episode 243. I asked for listeners to send in some questions and topics that they would want covered on the podcast, and we got a really good one from Trisha. Let me read to you her question, and then this episode we are inviting on Ashley Wright from Gypsy Gameschooler to help us with this topic. So here is the listener question from Trisha. Trisha says, my biggest struggle lately is feeling torn between unschooling and a more traditional approach. I personally love traditional learning, but my kids are very resistant to sitting, reading, and bookwork. I like the idea of unschooling, but I just can't give myself into that system because I feel like my kids won't learn enough with that approach. But would it be the best for them considering their wild nature? Should I be taming that wildness or cultivating it? After hearing arguments for both sides, I'm feeling so confused. If you haven't done a podcast on that topic, I personally could find it very helpful. So Trisha, we heard you loud and clear. This is an awesome topic. And so I invited on Ashley Wright from Gypsy Gameschooler, who has this exact experience that she can speak to, and I think you're going to find a lot of actionable strategies here. Remember, if there's anything we mention on the podcast with Ashley, you can find it in the show notes at 4onemore.com/243, and I will link to everything below this video as well. All right, so enjoy this conversation. This is about the struggle between unschooling and a traditional approach. Basically, should you tame the wildness in your kids or should you cultivate it? We're hearing things from both directions and you might feel pulled in both directions, but is there a middle ground? Is there a compromise? I think you're going to love this episode. Here's my conversation with Ashley Wright. Ashley, thank you so much for joining us today and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
All right. So tell us, we're going to jump right in because we have an awesome topic today that you are going to be a good fit for. So tell us a little bit about your family, how old your kids are, and we're really thinking about personality differences today and how that impacts homeschooling. So tell us a little bit about your family.
I have two kids. They are 8 and about a week away from being 10. So they're right in that almost tween age, sort of, which is a super fun age. Um, and I personally, I'm very type A, very controlling. Um, you wouldn't be wrong to call me a control freak. I have my master's in education, so I have a long background in education. I actually learned about unschooling before my kids were born when I was thinking about homeschooling while I was working on my graduate degree. And I thought that was amazing and super cool. And then I had kids and I was like, oh, I'm going to wait to teach them, reading. I'm going to wait until they're at least before I teach them their letters or anything. I'm going to just let them play. And my son turned 1 and was like instantly obsessed with letters. And so my brain was like, well, gosh, this is our learning window. We better do this because, if I wait, he might not be interested then. So we kind of dove into more formal learning than I had planned on. And it was, my son was, I think, 5 and my daughter was 4. And they were both reading. They'd started reading about 3, which is early. And I don't typically recommend that, but they were ready and they're still reading. So, I mean, my mistakes have not been too huge. And we were doing math on Khan Academy, and we were just all of us were burnt out. It was so hard to get them to drag them through the Khan Academy lessons, and it was getting hard. It was like, this shouldn't be hard. These kids are super smart. They love to learn. So where are we going wrong? And I had heard about game schooling a few times. Finally decided to give it a try, and it was amazing. We were doing more math, harder math in less time than they were taking for Khan Academy. So it was night and day difference. And we kind of really dove into game schooling, and that was really big for us. So I also, about that time, we started, well, actually a little bit before, I think, we started going to a homeschooling meetup that was local to us. And it was run by an unschooling mom, a radical unschooling mom. And if you're not familiar with radical unschooling, it's taking the principles of unschooling and applying it to like the rest of life. So kids don't have a formal bedtime. If they want to eat whatever, then that's, encouraged and enabled. And I've never really been able to get all the way to radical unschooling,
Hmm.
but we do definitely really kind of do the unschooling thing. And it was actually really, I mean, we always kept a little bit of formal stuff with, our daily games or whatever. And then COVID hit and we had some legal problems with our neighbors, which were so stressful that I couldn't handle anything. So
Hmm.
we had like 2 years of forced unschooling where I was just like, "I can't do it." And during those 2 years, they still learned. They were still learning so much. So I really, it's even though we weren't doing anything formal,
Hmm.
kids learn. It's what
Yeah.
kids do.
Yeah.
And so they were still learning. They still read, they can still do math, and we learned a ton of science and history, different stuff. So it was just really cool to see.
Hmm. So even though you knew about unschooling, it sounds like you, because your kids were so eager to learn, you thought we have to do something formal and structured right away while they're interested. Is that kind of, so you, if you could go back, which I hate saying this because we all have like regrets, right? But if you could go back, are you saying like you wouldn't have done the structured stuff with your kids?
I don't think I see, I don't know. Yeah, it's really hard to say that because
Yeah.
we are where we are now because of our
Yes.
experiences in the past.
Yes. That's right.
And if we hadn't done the structured stuff and gotten burnt out on it, would we be doing
Yes.
what we're doing now? Like,
That's
I can't
true.
say.
That's true.
But when I
When
do
we,
talk to sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead. When you do talk to what?
New homeschooling moms and, with little ones and they're wondering what they can do, I do always encourage just play.
Yes.
Read to your kids, play, explore the world. If they're interested in things, learn about it with them.
Hmm.
But I really, I there's only little ones, you know?
Yes, yes,
And
exactly.
play is so important for their development.
Yes,
So,
that makes
yeah, I
sense.
mean, and the other part of it was even though I personally really like unschooling,
Mhm.
society always expects more
Right,
formal learning,
right.
at least here in America.
Yeah.
That's always, oh, well, you got to teach your kids the 3 R's and
Mhm. Mhm.
college preparation. The local elementary school to where we were was talking about how their kindergartners were college bound.
Oh,
And I was like,
dear.
"Oh my goodness."
Wow, that's a lot of pressure.
Right?
Well, now let's define some stuff because I know we kind of are throwing terms around, and I always forget that not everyone understands what we're talking about. And that's my fault because I'm just like, well, let's jump in. But like, okay, so traditional, we all kind of get that. That's kind of like what we all grew up with, right? That's like your typical public school, even your typical private school. That's a traditional thing. You've got your books and you've got your all your separate subjects, and you're doing everything with workbooks and all that kind of thing, right? So, and then you mentioned, which is really good to mention, unschooling is this really broad term because for some people, like you said, your friend who met at this homeschool co-op, she was like this way extreme, you could say, and maybe you or other people might not be quite where she is. So, can you explain, like, when you use the word unschooling, or even just describe the different varieties, what does that mean in a homeschool world?
So I always say that if you ask 10 unschoolers what unschooling is, you're going to get at least 12 answers because it is such a huge, huge term.
Yeah.
But really, it's for me, it's child led learning. So that can mean that your kid decides they want to go to public school. And so you send them to public school because that's what they want. But they're going to approach it and get something different out of it than your typical public schoolers. It can also mean that your child desperately wants to learn a musical instrument, and so they get lessons. So there is formal learning within unschooling, or there can be.
Hmm.
There are also a lot of people like, oh, well, my family needs structure. You can have structure with unschooling.
Hmm.
We had a farm, we had a small farm with chickens and goats and stuff. And so I always had goats to milk in the morning. So all of our school stuff and our days really were uh, revolved around our farm chores. And then we did have bedtimes. I've always been really strict about bedtimes. So it was farm chores, bedtimes, and meal times. And those were our structure points. and then everything else was more fluid in the middle. But you can have as much structure as you need. The
Mhm.
key is that you focus on the needs of the child, and if your kid comes to you going, "Man, I'm just feeling lost," you can work with them to create your own family schedule that works for everybody.
Mhm. Now, and you've probably heard from moms, like their biggest fear, and this mom who sent us the question, like her biggest fear is unschooling is going to leave huge gaps. If I just let my kids decide what they're learning, if I'm not sitting down and saying, here's the curriculum, you know, they're going to have problems. How do you balance that and make sure, what are the challenges there, and how do you make sure that your kids aren't missing out on some huge thing they should be learning in, third grade or whatever?
So the first thing that we have to realize is that everybody has gaps. I have been through, let's see here, K through 12 plus a bachelor's degree and a graduate degree. So 18 years of public school. And it wasn't until I was working with my kids looking at our globe that I realized that the Galapagos Islands, which I'm a zoology major, so Darwin's like totally my jam. And he's all about he did a whole bunch of stuff with the Galapagos Islands. I legitimately thought the Galapagos Islands were off the coast of Africa. They're off South America. And I had my graduate degree at that point. It was like, I'm an educated adult.
Right.
And I didn't even know where the Galapagos Islands were. So
Yeah.
we all have gaps. But we also have to realize that we never stop learning. Nothing says that you have to cover US history in 4th grade.
Mhm.
Nothing says that you have to cover, the Civil War in 5th grade. Like it's all you can learn all the time. So
Mhm.
when for us right now, we're traveling full time. And it's really cool because we're able to go to new museums like almost every week. We get to see a different museum, so they always have slightly different stuff. So we're getting a lot of science that way.
Mhm.
And we spent the summer over on the East Coast in Virginia, and we saw all these really, really cool historic sites.
Mhm.
And we were totally learning a ton of history. I didn't know going into it, obviously, that we'd be seeing those sites. So we kind of started before we got there, learning about the Civil War and the Revolutionary War.
Mhm.
And we do a lot of that through listening to audiobooks in the car. That's one good way that we do a lot, and also watching documentaries together.
Mhm.
So I don't assign my kids reading. If I want them to read it, then I'm going to read it to them, or we're going to listen to the audiobook because that's the only way. But we were learning about those specific history areas while we were there. So that was really cool. And now that we're over in the Southwest, our local library that we have access to has tons of books about the area. So I was like, hey, do you guys want to learn about Arizona?
Mm. That makes total sense. I'm hearing from you. So, like, our mom is that sent us this question is saying, like, my kids are wild. She used the term wild, right? Should I tame the wildness or cultivate it? Or do you recommend compromise? And I'm hearing from you, you are doing a little of both. Like you said, you can have structure if you want certain structure. Now you mentioned you do have some like tried and true, I don't know if you want to call them tools in your toolbox, resources, methods. Tell us a little bit about your compromise options and like why do they work and why should other people try them?
So I totally both encourage the wildness and at some, tame the wildness. So
Mhm.
we have certain times it's like, okay, kids, we're going to go out to a restaurant for once in our lives and we have to behave. You're going to have
Mhm.
to shower beforehand. You're going to have to comb your hair. Your clothes, they need to be somewhat clean. You know, there are times and places to tame the wildness. But then,
Mhm.
like right now, I told my kids, okay, you have to be outside. You have to go play. And I'll let you know when you can come back in. They're
Mhm.
out there in the desert playing and getting thoroughly covered in dust, and they're loving it.
Mhm.
So that I think is really important is you don't have to go all one or all the other. You can be like, okay, this is, most of the time we're going to just be wild and free and encourage that, but maybe you go to church on Sunday morning. So okay, Sunday morning church, we're going to shower for and we're going to have some manners for. Or maybe you have, you know, dinner with family members. Okay, we're going to see our family, which we need to clean up for that. And
Hmm.
you can have certain times that are a little bit more structured. As far as specific things that we do, I mentioned game schooling. So if you don't know, game schooling is learning through games. And some people do it where all they do are games and that's their curriculum. Some people are more like me where they're like, oh, we basically unschool and we throw in some games because they're fun. Other people might have a gaming day that where they cover or they use it for like review
Hmm.
to support their curriculum. But it can be board games, dice games, card games, even video games, role playing games. They all teach us something. And so you don't have to find specific educational games. A lot of people are like, oh, well, I have addition bingo. It's like, yeah, I had that too and got rid of it pretty quick
Yeah.
because it's really boring. But so that's one thing that we do because games are really fun. They teach us a lot, but the kids are more willing to interact with them than, say, a worksheet.
Hmm.
Another thing that we do is the road schooling, where we travel. Some people travel full time like we do, some people just take trips. You can even do a virtual road schooling where if you're like, oh, this month we're going to travel virtually to Italy and go tour the Colosseum, or I think that's in Italy.
Yeah.
Did I mention my geography is terrible? So you can do it that way too. And oh, unit studies is the other one that we use a lot. So my kids will choose a topic and I'll help them find books from the library. I'll find documentaries and we'll see if we can find some games or a museum trip. And we'll just kind of do a bunch of different things that are loosely related to the topic.
I love that. And, like we could spend a whole episode on each of those three things you mentioned: game schooling, road schooling,
Mhm.
unit studies. And I'll mention to everyone, we will put links to your site in the show notes where you do have like resources, blog posts, and that kind of thing. So people can learn more about that. And maybe we'll have to have you on again and actually dive into game schooling or something, because that's like a unique one. But I love that. And I love the road schooling idea virtually. If you can't leave your house, you can still do tons of virtual field trips. So that's really fun. So now you had mentioned to me, like as we were corresponding about this episode, that you have had success focusing on one skill or subject or topic at a time. But then after you do this one thing, your kids are kind of free to go learn naturally. So I think we would all love a peek into your day of like, what does that look like? Give us an example. Like, what would the topic or subject be that's really a little more structured, or maybe, and then like, how does that work out in your day?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've done a number of different things. Kids are always changing and our situation in life is always changing. So we're always changing how we are doing things. But for a period of time, we were doing unit studies on different countries. So, one year or one month we'd be studying India. And so we'd just have library books about India, constant documentaries about India.
Mhm.
But a lot of that was really, here's the resources, explore at will. Then we started learning about history, and we had a book that we used, Absolutely Everything. It's really a cool book, and it's a nice broad overview of world history that's I thought was pretty unbiased. There was a whole section on Africa, a whole section on Asia, which usually you don't see that in Western society. So that was really good for me to see. And we read a chapter about a month. Yeah. And then we used that as a spine for a unit study. So I would, the chapters were pretty short. So we could read the chapter in probably 3 to 4 sessions of about 15 minutes each. And I read it to them. My kids were still pretty young. I don't think my daughter even remembers reading it, but so I would read it to them, and then we'd have a bunch of other resources that were on that chapter that they could explore at will. But the only thing I was really expecting was for those few minutes that I was reading to them, that was what, that's the expectation. And then everything else was just bonus on top of that. Right now, my kids have just started handwriting and spelling. So, like I said, they're 8 and nearly 10. So they are definitely old to be starting it. But I knew my husband, when he was little, and actually still, he still has terrible handwriting. When he was younger, his handwriting was so bad that teachers gave him like a pre-computer. It wasn't even really a computer, so that he could type on because they couldn't even read his handwriting. So I was like, well, clearly we've got some potential fine motor delays here that maybe we should wait. So I waited as long as I possibly could. We started handwriting this summer. My daughter had been writing on her own for a bit, so she and I have had to work a lot on correcting some bad habits. But my son has actually done really well with it, and we only spend, well, okay, it's probably more like half an hour longer right now because they're squirrels. But it's just a few words a day that right now we started spelling in the fall. So now we're just kind of combining spelling and handwriting. Say maybe a dozen words a day that they work on, and they write them twice, and then I tell them the word and they do their best to spell it, writing it out. And that's all that we do formally right now. And so we've got library books, actually they're over there. And so they can, explore those library books. We'll sometimes put on a documentary, but all of that is optional. And like I said, my kids spend most of the time playing outside anyway,
Mm-hmm.
so
So do you tend to pick the topics, or do you go on what your kids are interested in at the moment? I know unschoolers do both. Like, what do you tend to do?
I do a mix.
Okay.
Sometimes if I'm like, "Hey, this is really important," my
Mm-hmm.
son would have never chosen handwriting or spelling.
Mm-hmm.
Never in a million years. But I was like,
Yeah.
"This is something that we need to at least put in an effort for."
Right.
Um, I'm a big, feel like I really feel like if it's causing problems in the
Mm-hmm.
relationship, then it's not worth pursuing, especially handwriting. My son, or my husband, actually, he worked in a factory before we went on the road, and his handwriting was so bad that he was having problems getting them to understand, like, weren't being able to read his signature and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So he got a custom stamp made of his signature and his employee number and the date,
Oh.
so he could just stamp documents at work rather than having to write things. So I'm like, okay, clearly handwriting is not
Mm-hmm.
actually an essential skill. I think it's important, but you can get through life without handwriting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're selling our house right now, and we just signed documents online. We're
Mm.
not even in the same part of the country.
Yeah.
So
It's kind of like dyslexia. One of my kids had dyslexia, and it's like he had to come up with ways to live with it because he wasn't ever going to get rid of his spelling issues, reading it, but it's like you learn how to cope with your whatever your learning struggle is or whatever, right? So it's kind of like that. Like, yeah, you come up
yes.
with the tools to still survive. So when you're looking at, like, when family and friends or the community learns that you're kind of like, I don't know if you call yourself an unschooler, but that word, like, it has a lot of baggage, right? So have you faced any skepticism or criticism from people when they hear how you do homeschool?
So I am really lucky in that I haven't had much backlash, at least that I have seen. I think I have a really, don't mess with me aura.
Mhm.
Like, people they kind of just leave me alone, which I'm really appreciative of.
Mhm.
But having my graduate degree in education probably also helps some.
Right.
I'm sure my mother-in-law probably has some misgivings about the way I'm educating her grandchildren, but at the same time, I'm, not
So
a public school teacher, but I
yeah.
have an education background, so that probably helps.
Exactly. That's good.
Mhm.
So people are also wondering. So we mentioned the gaps in education, which I agree with you. Like, we all have gaps. Clearly, no one learns everything, right? But how people are going to also, I can think of people saying this question. Okay, but how do you assess your child's progress when you don't have like structured curriculum? You're not doing tests. Like, how do you figure out, okay, are they meeting the learning milestones? Or are they learning what I think they need to learn by the time they graduate? How are you working that out?
I'm always a bit confused by this question, and I have a question to ask back. Tell me, how do you get your kids to stop telling you everything they've ever thought about? Because my kids will come up to me and just start talking about everything. I'm like, "Oh my
Yeah.
goodness, yes, okay."
Yeah.
So, that's really how we
Yeah.
assess is they just tell us
They're
everything.
learning. It's like narration, right? It's like the narration concept, but maybe you don't call it narration. They're just telling back, right? Yeah.
Well, not even that, it's just like, "Oh, mom, I read this and this and this and this and this, and did you know about this?" And I'm
Yes.
like, "Wow, okay."
Yes. And it is a funny question because as homeschool moms, you clearly know if your kids get it or not too, right? So, yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, like, how have your routines changed over the years? Like, how do you manage time? You did mention you have certain like structure things like the chores at the beginning, whatever you were, what did you say, milking, there was milking some animals going on, and then like
Yeah.
lunchtime, is that what you said, meals and bedtime, is that still how you kind of structure your day?
Not at all. We're not on a farm anymore. So we pretty much sleep until we just wake up. My body is weird, and sometimes I'll just wake up too early, which is frustrating. Other times I sleep too late.
Hmm.
But my kids have gotten to where they usually sleep in more now, so often they'll sleep until 9 even.
Hmm.
And when they get up, then we do breakfast, and then they have one chore that they do, and then we sit down and do our spelling and handwriting. Today was an exception since we had this. I was like, you know what? You kids go outside and play. We'll do spelling and handwriting afterwards. And then, they're free to explore the rest of their day. If we are wanting to go somewhere earlier, then we're going to adjust that. We might be like, okay, kids, we actually have to get up at a reasonable hour today. We might have a drive day, or maybe there's a museum we really want to go explore, but it kind of closes on the earlier side, so we don't want to do it just in the afternoon. And we might skip handwriting or spelling that day too. Usually,
Hmm.
actually, if we're doing other things, we do skip those because they're kind of time intensive right now.
Right. So do you see yourself changing this approach in the future for any reason? Like, have you thought ahead, like high school, would you change it or you think you'd stick with it? Of course, you don't know till you get there, like what you really will do, right? But do you foresee any plans to change up the unschooling approach?
Oh, of course, absolutely. I mean, we're always evolving and adapting how we're doing things. So, um, as far as like high school specifically, I don't know what that's going to look like, obviously, like you said. But I've been around the homeschooling world for a while. I've been listening to a lot of what people have been saying. So I've collected a number of resources that I think would work really well for high school.
Hmm.
And I don't know if my kids will tolerate using them. We might not do any of them, but hopefully we'll at least be able to do some of them. I also think, high school is a great time to, get a job or do volunteer work or start an apprenticeship,
Hmm.
start kind of thinking about what you want your life after being a kid to be like, so what do you want your adult life to be like, and start preparing for that.
Yeah.
So we'll probably incorporate more of that.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's hard to say.
Yeah, it is. Now, did I miss anything major that you think we should mention to this mom who has this question about like, what do I do? Did I miss anything big that we should throw in here at the end? Or did we, I know almost feels like a super lot of information super quickly, doesn't it? But we'll put links in the show notes. But was there anything else you wanted to mention?
I think it's just really important to realize that you can do whatever you want as far as the education thing goes, but your kids are only going to learn what they want to learn, which is part of the reason why we really embraced unschooling, is because I can teach my kids about fractions all day long,
Mm-hmm.
but unless they want to learn, they're not going to learn anything.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you at least explore their interests, then they're interested in it, they're going to want to learn it. So then they're at least learning, something.
Yeah.
So if you are wanting the structured stuff and your kids are not doing well with the structured stuff and the formal sit down work, then I think it's more important for us to adapt our ways to fit our kids, because we're the adults. We can do that, right? We might have some personal work to do on our own, but we are better equipped to make those adjustments than the kid that is allergic to worksheets and has a complete and total meltdown every time you try and put one out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think it's not worth your relationship with your kid.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no amount of learning is worth your relationship with your kid.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's being strained by your approach, then it's time for a change.
Mm-hmm.
Might not be what you want to hear, but I do think that, that's the way it has to go.
Yeah, and you're right. Like it's a motivation thing. If your kids are motivated learners, they can learn anything, right? And that's what you're mentioning. Like games are
Mhm.
always, oh, kids are always up for a game. So I mean, if you can get in that sneaky learning, they might not even realize they're learning stuff, but they are. I love your approach where you're like, there's certain things you do need to learn. We're going to spend a short amount of time, short lessons, get it done. And then this is other stuff you can pursue on your own. So that's like a nice compromise where it's not totally one or totally the other. I think, maybe our listener, Trisha, will be able to like experiment with that kind of compromise middle ground, maybe, and then see if she needs to lean more one way or the other once she's there in the middle. Then that might be a good solution for her, just to experiment a little bit, right? And that's the fun thing about homeschooling. You
Yeah.
can totally make it whatever will work for your family. We're not stuck in one box, which is awesome because none of our kids are the same. Moms are all different. So I love this topic. I'm so glad, Ashley, that you were able to talk about it because this is something that I don't have as much experience on. So we will link in the show notes to your resources and just tell people where they can find you online.
Yeah, the best spot would be my blog, gypsygameschool.com. And I also have a YouTube channel that's also Gypsy Gameschooler, doing playthroughs of videos so you can see or playthroughs of games so you can see if the games are a good fit for your family.
Love it. Thank you so much, Ashley. I appreciate your time and being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. This is great.
So I hope for Trisha and all the other moms out there who were wondering the same thing, I hope you found some really great strategies that you can try with your kids to see if you can find a great middle ground there, maybe between the extremes of unschooling and a really strict traditional approach. Because homeschooling is flexible. It can be whatever it needs to be for your kids and your family. Remember to find the show notes at 4onemore.com/243. Be sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel and also subscribe to the Homeschool with Moxie podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for joining us today. And in the meantime, happy homeschooling.